Yeah, I know. More of this KGB document garbage. Shut up, alright? I'm having fun with it. So let's keep going with this. In this section, we are going to talk about what this document calls the fourth race. And this is where the Atlanteans show up. Now, you know, Atlantis is one hell of a controversial topic, and I'm open to it existing, and oddly enough, ever since I was led into catastrophism and all the science and history behind that, Atlantis has become more of a realistic possibility than it ever was before, like 10 years ago for me. So while I'm not an Atlantis researcher, I do find Atlantis absolutely fascinating now, because we now have the scientific evidence that allows us to believe that a continent could have absolutely been sunk overnight just a little while ago. And I mean just a few thousand years ago, not that long ago. And that might sound insane, even to Atlantean researchers, because I know you Atlantean researchers out there, everybody's, you know, starting to get stuck on the whole, you know, the deluge sank Atlantis, so it had to have been, you know, 12, 15, 20,000 years ago, or whatever date whatever date they put that stuff at now. But the reality is, the evidence points to us losing continents, not just Atlantis, only a few thousand years ago. All right, now that's a discussion maybe for part of this, whatever the hell is in this document. But I wanted to point out that even if you are skeptical of Atlantis, or you don't believe it at all, right, and you're about to shut this off because this is dumb, I get it, but hold on. Like I said, the science is there for Atlantis to have potentially existed. And if it could potentially have existed, then that means when we start to read other documentation on this, and the documentation goes into some of the science behind it, there might be something there. So once again, this KGB document might be full, and probably is full, of disinformation. Like, I completely get that. And I have no doubt that as we go through this section on Atlantis, that we're going to run into some weird stuff. All right, so and I completely 100% agree with anybody who says this document is garbage. It might be, I don't know, it might very well be, but there are aspects and information in this document that really absolutely correlate with all this kind of new historical evidence that we have now, and with all kinds of scientific evidence that has emerged in the past, you know, just 20, 30, 40 years. Right? This is really a newer phenomenon. Anyway, let's start reading this garbage and let's see what's up. All right, this section is the fourth race, the Atlantic. So this is 650. The first Atlanteans appear 5 million years ago. And remember, if I sound, or if any of the sentences are choppy or weird, I'm just reading the document verbatim, and because this has been translated from Russian into English, everything doesn't always line up. So it's not just me being absolutely stupid and not being able to read, but it's also the document is sort of chopped up here and there sentence-wise, every once in a while. Let's go on. Okay, the fourth race. The first Atlanteans, Myrmidons, appeared at the time of the Lemurians, about 5 million years ago, on a separated island in the Atlantic Ocean, which was isolated from the outside world. They were 4-meter giants with big heads with red, white, and yellow skin color. Already we're into some interesting stuff regarding Atlantean research and history. So they're talking about 4-meter giants, a little above 13 feet for those of us who want to use real measurement units, not the global homo garbage units, you know, meters, metric system, whatever the hell that crap is. Moving on. All right, so giants right now, right out from the get-go, we are now talking about giants. In this document, they've talked about some serious giants. Like, there's like 30, 40, 50 foot tall giants in this document. But that's like hundreds of millions of years before all of this. So giants are not a new addition to this document. But what's interesting here is that we are actually starting to run into a realistic height of giants that may have existed back in the day. 13 feet I know it sounds big, and it is huge. By the way, obviously, if I ran into a 13-foot person, that'd be crazy, man. Okay, I get it. But it's not impossible. There's nothing impossible about a giant person. And the 13-foot range regarding height actually lines up with a lot of our ancient ancestors' historical recordings about the kinds of, I guess we'll say, people that they had to deal with back in the day. So, back in the day, giants are all over the place in all of our ancient histories. And obviously nowadays, giants are not taken seriously because it's funny, the only reason why giants are not taken seriously today, there's two reasons. The first main reason, they're probably tied for number one. The first reason giants are poo-pooed and thrown to the side and you're a crazy schizo if you believe in them is because we do not have any 13-foot tall people walking around. We do not have a modern day reference that we can physically see and relate to in some form or another. Right? Humans are very tactile, visual, that's what we are. So if we don't see that kind of stuff, unfortunately, it is quite natural for people to disregard something as not possible if it is not currently happening to some degree. And catastrophism faces that in all aspects, right? That's everywhere. If something isn't happening now, it couldn't have possibly happened in the past. And even if it did happen in the past, it's like 8 billion years ago, so it's too far away to even care and think about. Right? That's the first problem that we run into giantism, or the concept of giants in history. And I understand that. There was a time to where I kind of fit into that area. But the reality is, we can't look at things like that. We can't just say something doesn't exist because it doesn't exist right now. Right? That would infer that we, A, know everything, and we obviously do not. But B, it would also infer that nothing changes over time. And if there's one thing that every single human on this planet should realize exists and is a constant, is that everything changes. You cannot run away from it. The second law of thermodynamics demands it. All right, so there's that. But the worst reason why people are so quick to discard the giant situation is because mainstream media, academia, mainstream everything basically, has gone out of its way to absolutely demonize and attack the concept. And they've done it to an irrational level. It's absolutely insane. Like, why is it that we find in the Western world that the concept of giants is just brutally attacked, right? If there's one thing that you should have learned in history by now, in all of your historical studies, this is something that I find to be extremely true. If you look at mainstream history, doesn't matter what period of time, literally, doesn't matter. If you find mainstream specifically demonizing some aspect of history, some individual of history, some part of history, and they do it with just an absolute, militant fervor. If you find that in mainstream, there's a good chance that something is being covered up, that something is there that people do not want the average person to figure out and realize is real. All right, so giants falls into this category. Like I said a second ago, giants, there's nothing impossible scientifically about a giant. There's no problem with this. You can have a larger human, 13 feet, while incredibly tall, realistically speaking, relative to us, human-wise. That's entirely possible. There's nothing wrong with that. Even more interesting is that we're talking about Atlantis, and they're already bringing up giants right out the gate. Now, what a lot of people may not realize about Atlantean research is that there's a lot of reason to believe that either giants fully occupied Atlantis, or more probably there were some giants in occupying Atlantis with other regular, what we would consider humans. right? So the leaders of Atlantis, for example, the quote-unquote gods, they may have actually been legitimate giants. Because during the period that Atlantis would have happened, not here, this is throwing us back 5 million years ago, but if we talk about Atlantis, how we kind of understand it now, it would have been in this transitionary period where we would have been coming out of a world full of giants and transitioning into a world full of people like us. What was happening was we, according to our ancient ancestors, so we had a situation to where the giants of the world were slowly finding it more and more difficult to exist. So the time period where Atlantis was existing was before the second huge main cataclysm was to hit Earth. And before that cataclysm hits Earth, and this would be the Venus event, for those of you who know this stuff, or at least right now, the chronological time period that we kind of have. Before the Venus event, Earth's gravity was different, and this has been, there's a lot of proof to support this. I won't get into it right now, but before the Venus event, Earth had a different gravitational pull, and because of this, it allowed larger creatures to exist, and this is why we were able to support things like mammoths or all of the megaflora and all of the megafauna. And the megafauna would have included, according to our ancestors, giants. But even at this period of time, giants were having a tough time existing. And in fact, the fact that we find in this document 13-footers is interesting, because if the further back you go, there were like 18, 20-foot giants, apparently. Right? So, and the reason why we don't find the 18, 20-footers at this period of time is because the very first major cataclysm that had hit Earth had already started Earth spiraling down into a gravitational direction to where huge beings, huge fauna could no longer exist. Like, they were having more and more trouble supporting their own weight, right? Getting around in their environment. And they were slowly dying off on their own. Any of those larger giants that was able to continue to exist up until like the Atlantean period, they probably were not the giants that we find in Atlantis. By that I mean the 20, let's just say the 20-footer giants. Those guys, if they still existed in this period of time, they were very much degraded, right? This is where we start to find and hear about the stories of messed up giants, of giants, eating people, of giants moving really slow, not because they're huge, but because, it's because they're huge, but it's because the gravity now is different from when they initially existed. So their existence was extremely hampered simply by the newer environment that Earth has found itself in at this period of time. That said, the gravity was still fine enough to where, giants of 8 to 13 foot tall stature, they could still exist. Like, they were still running around doing things. Earth had not had its next gravitational situation changed yet up until this point. So that means that it is entirely possible, scientifically speaking, that whenever you hear about giants being part of Atlantis, that may actually have been a legitimate part of the story. So I find it interesting that we see it here in this document. Now they go on to start talking about how the 4-meter giants, the 13-meter giants, were red, white, and yellow skin color. The skin color I haven't really heard too much about. Obviously, white had to have been there. But anything else, I don't know. I have nothing to say on that whole area. The whole Atlantean situation is messed up anyway. I don't have a lot to say as it is anyway. Okay, let's keep moving on. Let's see what else this thing tells us. All right. As a result of evolutionary development, their body size decreased. Interesting. So this document is blaming evolution. Okay. The next subrace of Atlanteans is formed by the so-called autochtones, people about 3 meters tall who existed about 2.5 million years ago. The average life expectancy of myrmidons and autochtones was about 600 years. It's interesting that they bring up the lifespan, because in the past, one of the conundrums that we find when we look at ancient history is the fact that we do see people apparently living for quite some period of time, or ruling, I should say, for quite some period of time. It's very common to find in all of our ancient historical stuff that we find everywhere. Whenever you have recountings of like the really, really old people, the old timers back in the day, they all seem to have really long lifespans. And then there's a very particular point to where suddenly lifespans are no longer long, right? There is a very, very specific time period where that comes to an end. Interesting that they talk about the 600-year lifespan. I don't know. Interesting. Okay. Approximately by this time, the following Atlantean subraces were formed: white, red, yellow, and black, which steadily developed independently of each other in 7 parts of the world. The methods of managing people through great teachers remained the same. They don't really go into the methods, not that I've seen yet, so I don't know what that means. They became preachers and rulers of many generations of mankind and developed independently of each other. The first developed Atlantean civilization was the Toltec civilization, which existed about 1 million years ago. All right. The man's height was 2.5 meters. Toltecs had proportional facial features, and their average life expectancy was about 300 years. Don't have anything to add about the Toltecs right now. That is It's interesting that they bring it up at all, because the Toltec civilization, if you go and you look at South America's legitimate mythologies and stuff, the Toltecs are not who you think they are according to South Americans. I'm not going to get into that here right now, because that's a whole 10,000 shows. Interesting that they would mention the Toltec civilization in conjunction with Atlantis. That there is some legitimate connection there. All right, and they bring it up. All right. Anyway, Toltecs had a developed writing system and laws. They were able to replicate texts and wrote on thin metal plates, which they kept in leather cases. They had schools and universities. Exceptional knowledge was borrowed from the quote-unquote white teachers. Now, for all of you people who, lose their mind at racial stuff nowadays, hold on. The white teachers they're probably talking about, I would guess, at this point in time, they're probably talking about the shiny ones. For those of you who are not familiar, apparently at some point in time in the ancient past, there seems to have been a race of humanoids who cultures all across the world, they say they have white skin, or they call them the shiny ones. But it's important to understand they are not talking about your average white person today. As far as I know, none of these people exist today. We don't have a physical analogy anymore. These ancient cultures are literally talking about people with paper white skin. When they say alabaster skin, they go out of their way, a lot of histories go out of their way to make sure you understand that they are not talking about Europeans. They're talking about some other race which had just pure white skin, and that's a whole other topic in and of itself. Interesting that it's mentioned here, and I mean, it would make sense if we're following some kind of a evidence-based chronology. Yeah, okay. The first legendary island state was created on the island Atlantis, which occupied most of the Atlantic Ocean. Its capital was the city of Golden Gate, which was distinguished by its majestic architecture, golden columns, monuments, and fountains. And we all, that's pretty much standard for Atlantis. Everything is amazing over there. In all parts of the earth, Atlanteans built temples in the form of spherical golden domes that dissipated energy flows and positively influenced the Earth's biosphere. This is where stuff has to get interesting then. The reason why I say that is because all of the studies that are now going on, all the experimentation with electricity relative to life and how it affects the development of life on this planet is unbelievably fascinating. So what I find interesting here is that this document is claiming that Atlanteans built temples to help positively influence the entire planet's biosphere. Now, is that something that can potentially happen? Yeah, you of course, right? If we're going, right now the theory is, backed up by science, is that Birkeland currents are fueling the solar system, essentially, which means that everything is electric and plasma. So if you are able to control those magnetic fields, those electromagnetic fields, if you have some way of controlling those, there's really no reason why you could not sway that control over towards ensuring that the planet's life develops in a positive way, right? So fascinating. Actually, that's pretty damn cool that they even say that. Like, why even waste your time with that? There's something to be said about the possibility of ancient cultures understanding that electrical control was key to ensuring life existed. And I don't see a lot of Atlantis researchers, or any researchers really, that talk about the ancient past, talk about any of these new findings with regards to electricity and how electricity literally controls how DNA functions, for example, right? That's a whole other show. All right, let's keep going. So right now we have Atlanteans trying to influence Earth in a positive way. Interesting. All right, let's see where this goes. Due to changes in the ancient architecture of temples, when crosses began to be placed on spherical domes, the terrestrial biosphere lost a significant mass due to the lack of electromagnetic sedative waves affecting the positive growth and development of flora and fauna. The cross... Okay, let's talk about this really quick. So the cross symbol, for all you militant atheists out there, you guys all well know that the cross is an Abrahamic symbol and, Jesus and blah, blah, blah. Right? That's pretty much what everybody just kind of knows, even religious people, and that's where it stays. The cross is interesting because cultures all over this planet were already revering a cross-like shape long before Catholicism, Christianity, and all of that stuff started showing up. So, for example, when the Spanish started exploring down there in South America, one of the things they found down there was that they were already worshiping crosses. And so much that, they were like, what the hell? And obviously, from their perspective, that was just reinforcement that the Abrahamic God existed. So, fine, for whatever, for them, great. They even went on ahead and built a huge cathedral, or not a huge, they built a huge church around that cross that already existed in South America. And you find the cross shape all over the planet. You find it in all countries, all continents, doesn't matter. And all of these things, they predate Christianity. Isn't that amazing that this cross that's found all over the world is never mentioned at all in mainstream history? It's never or barely ever mentioned even in alternative history. And the reason why is because people don't look far enough into this, and so they think that if you find a cross before, pre-Christian cross and stuff like that, perhaps that's ammunition for religious people to use against, atheists to say, oh yeah, God existed. See, of course, everybody already had the cross, right? So, God was already talking to everybody and influencing everybody. And that's why people shy away from admitting that the cross was being revered by ancient cultures long before Christianity. And it's unfortunate because there's got to be a reason, right? I mean, people all around the planet just suddenly started revering crosses, putting crosses on top of their buildings. This doesn't seem to go into it, but the cross that cross symbol, it shows up at a very particular time in ancient human history. And the time that this shows up, or the reason why this cross shows up, is that in the sky, while our solar system was trying to reorient itself, there is a period of time where the planets are much closer to one another, and you have a bunch of plasma events happening in the sky. So everybody saw these plasma events. One of the events that they saw from Earth's perspective ended up looking like a cross, right? And so people took that symbolism that they saw in the sky, and everybody would have seen it, obviously, as these conjunctions were happening and as the plasma was flowing and all the electrical effects were going on up there in the sky. People took this symbol and they adopted it. And in fact, a lot of religious or country type of symbols, any kind of symbol, I'm not going to say most, but a lot of symbols that we find in ancient history are derived directly from plasma formations that were seen in the sky. And I'm not going to say that's one. I mean, that's basically proven at this point, as far as I'm concerned. You can argue with it, but I don't know how you get rid of that. Anyway, but this document randomly starts to say that crosses just magically start appearing on top of buildings and ruins the electromagnetic effect that the original building was having on the planet. I wonder if it'll go into explaining why they started adding did they do it out of religious fervor for during that period of time? They would have seen the formation up in the sky and decided to use it, but why would they ruin their own effect? Like, they would know that the domed buildings are there to help Earth. So I wonder why they would go out of their way to ruin... Yeah, I don't know. Let's keep going. I don't know. In Atlantis, there was a detachment of pilots, the so-called Vimans. They're probably talking about Vimanas. The so-called Vimans, who moved 850,000 years ago in the atmosphere and in space. The Atlantean weapon, Mosh Mac, which they inherited from the great teachers, quote-unquote, was used in the conquest of other peoples. As follows from the texts of ancient manuscripts, with the help of a directed beam, the Atlanteans could destroy entire cities and destroy the world with one blow. Apparently, we are talking about a high-frequency Viton radiator, which has a detrimental effect on living organics and the central nervous system of living organisms. Yeah, that's interesting. A Viton radiator weapon. Now, I know Atlantis, it gets credit for all kinds of, it's supposed to be this huge futuristic thing and blah, 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 all of that stuff. I don't know. Man, that's a tough one. So they're already giving Atlantis credit with Vimanas. Vimanas are apparently supposed to be an ancient form of air travel, a vehicle, for those of you who don't know. So they're saying that Atlanteans would have had Vimanas. My problem with Vimanas being attributed, well, really anywhere in history, if I'm honest, with Atlantis is that a lot of the stories with Atlantis, when you start looking around, it's not that they're... A lot of the stories of Atlantis are still very grounded. Let's put it like that. So most stories that you can correlate to a possible Atlantis connection, they're not talking about high level of technology, at least in the sense that we think nowadays like science fiction. They were smart, intelligent people, but it sounds like they were still operating on a lot of kind of basic old world principles. By that I mean, their ships were still made of wood. They were using chariots and swords and spears and stuff like that. Granted, they were supposed to be really high quality, and these soldiers and all of that stuff, they were high level. They would definitely give you a run for your money. They're not cavemen or anything. But what you don't really find all that often is, a lot of futuristic stuff relegated to Atlantis. Now, I could be wrong with that as well, because one of the other problems with Atlantis is that there could be a lot of other cultures that we don't realize are Atlantis that are being talked about, but it's being labeled as some other, far-off land or fake land or whatever. That's where Atlantean research gets difficult and it gets a little weird. So, okay, so they're going to give Vimana's credit to Atlantis. Another problem with that, okay, so Atlantis is supposed to have gone down right at the end of some huge war that they started. Now, that war and what it's talking about, there's a lot of jumbled up stuff there, and there's a lot to dig into, so I'm not going to get into any of that. But the basics of it is that nobody is claiming that Atlanteans had all this crazy ass technology, and the reason why is because what you read is that Atlanteans had lost the war. Like, they were done. Like, they had been beaten back. And they had been beaten back by people who, by no accounts, are even referenced in any way, shape, or form to having any kind of high-level technology, right? The ancient Athenians are credited for beating back the Atlanteans. And we don't have any real reason to believe that the culture of the ancient Athenians, they weren't rocking laser guns and they weren't flying around, right? It sounds like they were using basically the same kind of technology, war technology, chariots, swords, spears, etc. So if a culture was able to defeat Atlantis or the Atlanteans, it would be hard, I believe they would be hard pressed to defeat a culture with swords and spears if the Atlanteans really did have all of these death rays and control of electricity and could fly around, right? The Vimanas alone would probably be enough to just wipe out whatever enemy you had. So I have a problem when we start talking about Atlantis being some insanely high-level futuristic civilization. We don't have the evidence for that. I think if Atlantis was real, it was probably an extremely high-level civilization, but it was not, people weren't running around with iPhones and droids and stuff. Nobody was doing that, right? So, or at least I haven't seen the proof. So if the claim that they have some sort of a high-frequency, radiator which immediately or has detrimental effects on living things, you would think if you had that level of technology, you would not lose your battle, unless the other side had the same kind of stuff. And of course, when we look at the other stuff, we don't have any reason to believe that the ancient Athenians, in this example, had anything that would counteract that stuff. Right? I'm not saying that stuff doesn't exist, and I'm not saying that maybe some of this is real. I don't know, but I just haven't seen the evidence for it. So this is that kind of thing that we have to be careful with. All right, moving on. 850,000 years ago, the leaders of Atlantis organized a rebellion against the gods because of a disagreement with the existing difference in the number and dimensions that existed among the people. Traditionally has 5 fingers on both hands, and consequently the 10-dimensional measurement system and 6 to 12, 14.4 V, dimensional system of measurement of the gods, having 6 fingers on both hands, with which people were hard to deal with. The 12-dimensional system of measurement imposed on people caused disagreements that led to an uprising that ended in the greatest tragedy in the history of Earth. Okay, couple of things here. So first of all, I realize that what I read sounds a little disjointed, but that's not me. That's the way this is written. Just pause your screen and look at that. So so this is interesting. So they're saying basically people with 5 fingers on both hands were having a disagreement with people with 12 fingers. Not on both hands. You know what I mean? 5 fingers on each hand, 10 total, and then other people had 6 fingers, 12 total. You know what I mean? Don't shut up. So anyway, this is interesting. I don't know why they're talking about dimensions with fingers. The 12-dimensional system of measurement imposed on people caused disagreements. The measurement system. I was actually making fun of metric system earlier, but check this out. The imperial system is a base 12 system. I wonder if that 12 came from the original or from the giants that had... Okay, really quick before we go down this rabbit hole, just a heads up. There is a ton of historical accounts of giants. We already talked about all that. But a lot of these giants actually had 6 fingers on each hand instead of 5. And this was a very common thing to find. Even more interesting, these bodies actually, especially when the settlers came to North America, when they were digging up graves and stuff, they actually end up finding a lot of giant bodies with 6 fingers. I wonder, God, is that the basis of the imperial measurement system? Is it that simple? That it came from people who would have been operating at a very high level of intellectual capacity. These giants were no joke. So also, by the way, giants, most people when they think about a giant, they think about a dumb, lumbering, being just kind of dragging his knuckles or whatever. That is not how any of our ancestors describe the vast majority of the giants. The vast majority of the giants described, they're huge, muscular, they're extremely smart, right? These are not pushovers. There is a reason why we have a lot of ancient histories talking about how at certain points in time, the rulers were actually 6-fingered giants. Like these people were legit. I wonder if that's the true orientation or the origination of the imperial system. And they're talking about it here. It's causing a problem. Fascinating. It would make sense too, because groups like the Masons or whatever, they would probably hold true to that occult stuff, right? Honoring, well, I use the term honoring. I'll just say in remembrance of a time period where highly intelligent beings who were giants had 6 fingers, and that measurement system that was created by the giants with 6 fingers, maybe that's the true optimal one, and that's why it continues in a lot of secret societies and circles, like the Masons. I wonder if that's... I gotta look into that. Okay. Okay, let's go on. So now we have... Okay, so we're at the point to where the greatest tragedy apparently on Earth happens to Atlantis. All right. The leaders of Atlantis, who defend the gods, or defied the gods, made an irreparable mistake, which led to a change in time and to the death of a large part of the island of Atlantis. The leaders of Atlantis set their Vimana pilots to destroy the Agartha, the shelter of the gods inside the earth. Now that's an interesting perspective. Remember, if you haven't listened to the other stuff about this, the other 4 garbage shows that I made about this, go listen to those, because there's a point to where they talk about inner Earth. Like, they talk about the Earth being hollow. They talk about, that's the sun that glows in the middle of Earth. We'll talk about that stuff in depth, not now, later. But anyways, that's interesting that they are willing to say that the Atlanteans went to war with the people of Agartha. I wonder if maybe there's something interesting there. Okay. It's an interesting take. And they send their pilots. So they're not marching armies to Agartha. They're sending down basically air raids. With the help of the weapons of the gods, the Vimans sent a beam of a power crystal from space to the center of the Earth, which led to an explosion of unheard of power and the split of the island of Atlantis, the main part of which plunged into the depths of the ocean. The Sargasso Sea is now located at this place. Most of the gods who lived underground and enjoyed the benefits of the paradise they created died due to the thermonuclear explosion of the inner core. Alright, so my problem with this... So, this is where information like this gets weird, because that's one hell of a claim. Basically, Atlanteans send an air raid down into the center of the Earth, and then they have a space crystal, shoot a laser beam into the center. See, that gets a little weird for me. Wait, what? I'm gonna have to dig around and try to find why this document would come to these conclusions. Is this really what, like, the German scientists were figuring out back in the day, or any of the scientists, really. I mean, anybody who was studying this. Is this really what they were finding? I have not seen the evidence for that. That's a little crazy. But, like I said, maybe there's kernels of truth here and there involved in this. My only other problem is, so right now, the way the chronology looks for if Atlantis was real and if Atlantis sank, it didn't have anything to do necessarily with a beam, from Atlanteans shooting the core of the Earth. There's none of that. By all accounts, it seems like it was simply, not simply, but there was a planetary catastrophe with Earth running into other planets or flying close by other planets that create the conditions that would allow continents to sink. What's interesting about this document, and I've covered this in other shows, is that if you have one continent sink, the entire planet is going to absolutely be affected by that outcome, right? You don't have a continent sink and keep going about your day no matter where you are on Earth. If a continent goes down, the planet is changing. It's weird that they don't mention that. You would think that would be part of it. All right. Let's keep going. After this tragedy, the Earth changed its orbit around the sun at a distance equal to 1 AU a day instead of 48 hours, made up the usual 24 hours for us. Some of the surviving Atlanteans formed modern humanity. Now that might be true. There might be some real truth in that. But okay, they are willing to admit that the orbit of Earth was changed due to the Atlantis event. And that would be correct. Like right now, that actually does follow with our current scientific understanding of catastrophism and what would have sunk Atlantis. And like I said, I don't know if I said it, but this would have been the Venus event, right? This is where Earth and Venus have a few close calls, with one of the close calls being the coup d'etat on Earth, basically, and getting rid of Atlantis and other parts of the planet as well, right? But when this happens, not only does Earth just geographically suffer and get beat up, but also the Earth's orbit changes. And this is recorded, by the way. Like the days, the time, all of this stuff changes during this event. So at least they're willing to admit that the Earth's orbit changed because of the event. It's just interesting that they would say that it's a laser beam from space. I don't know about that. Okay. An internal explosion inside the planet led to the displacement of the electromagnetic and geographical poles. And that is exactly what we find as well. We have the scientific evidence for that and the historical evidence for that as well. So that, I'm glad they say that. That gives... See, this is what I'm talking about, man. They put in chunks of truth and they mix it with insanity. Like, what are you supposed to do with that, man? That's so obnoxious and frustrating. All right, let's keep going. The Toltecs were replaced by Akkadians, representatives of the white race who reigned on Earth around 600,000 years ago. Now remember, they're probably not talking about what white people, European type of white people. They are talking about a legitimate paper white-skinned race. Among them were Semites, who distinguished by belligerence, energy, and excellent health. Or who were distinguished by belligerence, energy, and excellent health. Something to note, in the past, the people, this is basically proven, so when they say Semites, they are not talking about the Semites of today. They are talking about a completely different people, and this is, by the way, Jewish scholarship that admits this. This is not something crazy. This is really high-level Jewish scholarship. A lot of people don't realize that the Semites of today are not the Semites of the past. Completely different situation, and that's a whole other topic in and of itself, which would probably get the channel banned. Just want to throw that out there, but that's... Okay, anyway, let's keep going. All right, what do we got? Most of them became nomads. The distinctive features of this sub-race were quarrelsome with neighbors, vindictiveness, and suspicion. Their descendants were the Jews. Oh, they even say it right there. Interesting. The censors of North Africa, the Kubalcanes, in the Kubal Nains of northern Hindustan. The Akkadians waged war against the Semites and defeated them. They were distinguished by their entrepreneurial spirit and were colonists, achieved great success in science, navigation, astronomy, and astrology. They built large cities and established contacts with the farthest regions of the earth. Their direct descendants were the Phoenicians and the peoples of the Mediterranean. Yeah, okay, and that would basically jive. So there's something up top on this page that didn't quite fit with, what does this say? Bugs in the Patola Offensive saved part of humanity in the number of 14,400 people for Solon. I don't know if that's supposed to be Solon, but there's our number again of 14,400. This is the third time we have seen this number in reference to people basically being allowed to live or survive. Makes you wonder if that's a triplicate, a duplicate, I don't know. And I don't know why they put it right there. It's at the very top of the page, and it's not part of the paragraph we were originally reading. I'm not sure what that is. Okay, anyway. The last subrace of the Atlanteans are the Mongols, who descended from the Taurians and settled in the steppes of eastern Siberia. They were nomads and farmers. And also, once again, the original Mongols are not the Mongols of today. That's also something to remember. And this is also Mongol history. This is their stuff as well. It backs it all up. This isn't like a, politically correct garbage thing. That whole history over there is absolutely scrambled and jacked up. And while you can find some of the real stuff, the vast majority of it is absolutely sanitized garbage. Anyway, neither here nor there for this topic. All right, 450,000 years BCE, the gods, quote unquote, from the Iron Planet arrived on Earth. Now, don't forget, this document considers this random iron planet that has a weird, orbit in our solar system that comes around every 12,000 or whatever years, right? That whole situation. This document blames an iron planet on all of these electrical phenomena. And they use iron because this document is smart by following, the electromagnetic sciences. It doesn't know about Birkeland currents, or at the very least, it doesn't come out and, it kind of talks about them, but it does not identify them. So this document seems to be looking for a way to attract electricity, to have all this crazy stuff happen. And I guess a planet made of iron is what made sense to them, right? So the planet may have actually existed, but that doesn't mean it was iron. There's no reason for that. That's this document, I think, trying to cope with what it finds. Anyway, after the death of Atlantis, the gods from Venus, as it follows from the texts of the Ahnenerbe almanacs, German scientists had at their disposal the original legendary manuscript of the List of Kings, compiled by the Egyptian philosopher. And we are going to stop here because I've already done a show on this next part. All right, so it might have even been the first episode of this. I don't know. Anyway, go watch that if you want to hear the rest of this portion. So we'll stop right here. But what do we get out of this, right? So we get they try to explain Atlantis, and they try to explain how it goes down. And as we've covered, that whole situation gets weird. And these guys, or this document, it does not blame the cosmological situation on the destruction of Atlantis. It blames a weapon system. And unfortunately, that the concept of a weapon system destroying everything, some super high-tech futuristic weapon that existed back in the day that we've no evidence for or anything like that is what did everything. That I would not be surprised if that was put into this document for disinformation purposes, because we don't have any reason to believe that any of that stuff happened or existed, but mainstream, unfortunately, does promote that kind of an ideological set of information, right? And people latch onto it, especially people, unfortunately, there are a group of people out there who are attracted to this kind of evidence governments and institutions know this, and they know that they can play with those people psychologically to keep them from the truth. So you throw stuff out like this to where you have like a Death Star weapon up in space back in the day, and people are immediately, they go to it, and they can make all these cope arguments to try to say that, yes, this is what happened. And once that happens to an individual or a group, you know, that group has now been taken care of. That group is now no longer a threat to your organization. So just be careful with that crap. You know, don't fall for everything. Just because something sounds great, that doesn't mean that it legitimately happened. Never forget, there are people on this planet who are not interested in any of us knowing the truth. And there are quite a few unbelievably messed up tactics that these people are willing to employ on a grand scale to ensure that everybody's thrown off the trail, right? And so that's why I say I don't have a pet theory here. We're just looking at this objectively, adding in the information that we've learned over time, see what we can get out of this. Just be careful, all right? All right, I'm done talking. We get it. More crazy schizo stuff about Atlantis. God knows what's true, what's not true. But, you know, the KGB did go out of its way to put together this document. So there's something to gain out of this. Even if it's just we've identified a misinformation campaign, you know, that's still valuable. You know, that's still something to keep in mind. Okay, I got other stuff to do.